Kings, Second Kings. We've spent some time with the prophets in the last few chapters, and we've been reminded who God is and what God's doing in the middle of all this seeming chaos. We've seen God's sovereign power to save and to judge on display. And so we're ready to go back to the Kings. And it's important to be reminded of all of God's activity in the middle of this, because from this point forward in the book of Second Kings, we are going to see more and more of God's judgment on Israel and Judah. The writer begins with Judah, because before we talk about judgment, we should probably be clear what this judgment does not mean. It does not mean that God will abandon his promise. It's actually been a long time since the writers talked about the kings of Judah. I'm talking all the way back in 1 Kings. But here in verses 16 through 24, he summarizes what we need to know about the reign of a man named Jehoram. Even though Jehoram's father, Jehoshaphat, was a pretty godly man, he himself wasn't. He didn't follow in his father's footsteps, but instead he followed in the footsteps of Ahab, who was the king of Israel. It says, now even though Jehoshaphat, it doesn't say this, I'm saying this. Even though Jehoshaphat was a fairly good man, he wasn't very wise, because he had actually allowed his son to marry Ahab's daughter. This was part of a, I think, satanic conspiracy, really, to ruin Judah. And it did have a terrible effect. This relationship had a terrible impact on Jehoram. It says, and he walked in the ways of the king of Israel as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Not only did Jehoshaphat allow his son to marry an ungodly woman, it seems like there was a time when he actually shared his rule with his son in a kind of setup that we might call a co-regency, meaning they were both acting as king. And yet how foolish to allow your son to have this kind of power if he was an ungodly man. And yet, even though this was extremely sad and disappointing, it doesn't cause God to swerve from his plan. He's made a commitment to David. The writer wants us to keep remembering that one of his sons would serve as an eternal king. This is our hope. And even though everything is going terrible at this point, God's going to keep that commitment. The writer says, yet the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David and his servant, since he promised to give a lamp to him and his sons forever. Even though God wasn't going to wipe Judah out, that didn't mean he wasn't going to discipline them. First of all, Edom revolted against Judah and set up a king of their own. And this is we're going to read about this later in the prophets. When Jehoram went to deal with their rebellion, his army had to flee for their lives, and his commanders barely escaped after having been surrounded by the Edomites. Then after that, Libnah revolted as well. After Jehoram came his son Ahaziah. Now ever since God spoke to Elijah about the men he would use to bring judgment on Israel, we've been waiting to see that judgment take place. And in verses 25 to 29 of chapter 8, we get the setup. First of all, the writer tells us Ahaziah began reigning after his father died. Then he tells us his mother's name. And this is significant in that she was a granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. And we're going to meet her later. At some point, the king of Israel went to war with Syria, and Ahaziah must have sent some troops out to help him. But Joram was wounded in the battle, went back to be healed of those wounds. And when Ahaziah came to see him, because he had heard he was sick, judgment happens. Something bad happens. The scene is set. So Ahaziah is going to visit Joram, and that scene is set in chapter 8, and then the judgment moves forward in chapters 9 and 10. Elisha calls one of the sons of the prophets to himself, and he tells him to go to where someone named Jehu is. And even though Jehu's in the middle of a meeting, he wants this prophet to call him out and take him to a more private spot, and then anoint him as king over Israel. So that's what Elisha wants this son of a prophet to do. And then once he's done, Elisha says, you need to run. The servant of the prophet then goes to where Jehu is, and when he arrives, he finds Jehu in a meeting, just like Elisha said, with the commanders of the army. And you can imagine this would have been a little intimidating, walking into a group of soldiers. And yet he bursts in and he tells Jehu, I have a word for you. And everyone's kind of stunned silent, listening. They're just surprised to see this young man's boldness. And so Jehu says, who are you talking to specifically? And the young man is like, I'm talking to you. And he goes with Jehu into the house where he anoints his head with oil and tells him exactly why God set him apart as king over Israel. And what's the reason the young man gives in chapter 9, verses 7 and 8? He says, "You shall strike down the house of Ahab your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel." And so this is judgment on Ahab. And then immediately after saying this, the prophet opens the door and he sprints. Now you can imagine being Jehu here. What just happened? And obviously the rest of the men who were there that day must have been thinking the same thing. When Jehu came out with the oil dripping down his head, they said to him, "Is all well? What did that mad fellow come to tell you?" And you can be sure they'd ask questions. Obviously, Jehu has oil all over him. And yet at first he says, it was just crazy talk. Maybe because he's still processing what he had been told, actually. Maybe because he wasn't sure how these men would react. He wanted to feel them out. And yet they pressed him. And so finally he says, and so he spoke to me saying, "Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel." Well, this is what the commanders of the army of Israel seem to have been waiting for. They didn't respect Joram. And so the moment Jehu told them this, the writer says, in haste, quickly, every man of them took his garment and put it under him on the bare steps, and they blew the trumpet and proclaimed, "Jehu is king." Once again, in this story, we're seeing that God really is sovereign and that he's absolutely serious about judging those who rebel against him. As we looked at Ahab and we saw all the evil things he and his wife were doing, we might have grown discouraged and wondered, did God notice? And yet he did notice. And he had a plan that he steadily worked out to execute justice on them. It may take time, but God is always just, and he always executes judgment on the wicked. The writer then brings us back to Joram, who we might remember was at a place called Jezreel after he had been wounded by the armies of Syria. Once Jehu realized he had the commanders of the army behind him, he made sure that no one pre-warned the kings who were down in Jezreel, and he got in his chariot and he rode down to where Joram was. And Ahaziah as well, the king of Judah, had come up to visit Joram, you remember. While the kings were resting or healing or doing whatever kings do, a watchman was standing on the tower, and he was trying to make sure that they were alerted to any possible dangers, when suddenly he saw Jehu riding towards them. Obviously, they didn't know why Jehu was coming. There was a war going on with Syria, and so they wondered what news he was bringing. And so Joram tells the watchman to send a horseman to meet them and ask, "Is it peace?" The horseman rides out and asks Jehu what's going on, and Jehu says, "Forget peace, get behind me." So then he sent a second horseback rider, the king of Israel, since the first one wasn't coming back. And the same thing happened, only now they're all coming a little bit closer, and the watchman can see the way the chariot driver is driving, and he knows there's only one person in all of Israel who drives like that. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. By now, Joram's getting an idea of what's coming. And so he gets into his chariot along with Ahaziah, and they go out to meet Jehu. And you know where they meet him. They meet him at the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. You remember him? That man that Ahab murdered? Joram is still hoping that he's wrong about what's happening, I think. And so he asks Jehu, "Is it peace?" And he finds out very quickly it is definitely not peace, because Jehu responds, "What peace can there be so long as the whorings and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many?" Joram freaks out when he hears that, and he starts to run, and Jehu draws his bow and shoots him through the shoulders, piercing his heart. Looking around, Jehu sees where he died, and he realizes this is completely fitting, and he tells his assistant to throw him on the plot of ground that belonged to Naboth. Why? According to chapter 9, verse 26. "As surely as I saw yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declares the Lord, I will repay you on this plot of ground. Now therefore take him up and throw him on the plot of ground in accordance with the word of the Lord." Jehu says this is God's plan, to judge Ahab's family for what they did to Naboth. It's been so many years, but God has not forgotten. From here, Jehu executes God's judgment on Ahaziah as well, and then goes to Jezreel, where Jezebel is still living, to finish her off. Now this is some woman, Jezebel. There's a reason you don't name your daughter Jezebel, right? She is some woman, and you have to see this. She must have heard some reports about what happened, and yet when she hears Jehu is approaching, what does she do? She puts on a show. And she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out the window. When Jehu enters the gate, she even goes so far as to mock him. Is it peace, you Zimri, son of murderer of your master? And believe me, she shouldn't have been talking about being a murderer, seeing how many people she had murdered herself. I'm not sure what she's doing dressing herself up and mocking Jehu, except maybe she thinks if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in style. Jehu looks up and asks if anyone can help him, and there are 2 or 3 eunuchs there, and they are definitely willing. If you spend time with this woman, you're willing. And he tells them to throw her down, and they do. Her blood splatters on the wall and the horses, and they trample her. And after watching Jezebel fall to her death, what's Jehu do? He goes and eats. He's a tough guy. He's a soldier. While he's eating, he begins to feel a little badly for her, and maybe not for her, but just for leaving her there, and because she's the queen. She was the queen. And he sends someone back to bury her, but when they arrive, she's been eaten. They find out she's been eaten. It says, but when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. They tell Jehu, and something clicks in his mind at that point, and he remembers what Elijah had said about her. This is the word of the Lord, he says, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. As we read the Bible, we are reading reality. In other words, we're seeing the way God is and the way the world really is. And certainly one of the things that we're seeing very clearly here in this story is that now listen to me, when God makes a promise to judge, he keeps it down to the letter. Even though Elijah's gone, his prophecies regarding Naboth, Ahab, and Jezebel have all come true. They thought they got away with it. They didn't get away with it. All that is left now is what he said about Ahab's family. Jehu's not slow to do what he needs to do here either. Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. Jehu gives them a chance. He sends a letter to the people who were in charge of that city and who were in charge of Ahab's sons, saying they should select the one that they think is best and say that he's king, and then have them fight for the right to rule. But all these men know Jehu, and because they know Jehu, they're afraid. And so they said to each other, behold, the 2 kings can't stand before him. How then can we stand? Smart. So they write back to Jehu saying something like, whatever you want us to do, we'll do. Jehu likes this response, obviously, and so he gives them a test. If they're really for him, he wants them to behead all of Ahab's sons and bring them to where he is. They listen. And the very men who were in charge of bringing Ahab's sons up slaughter them, put their heads in a basket, and send them out to Jehu. When they arrive, Jehu tells the messenger to take them and lay them in 2 heaps at the gate of the city until the morning. He sees this as an opportunity, I think. And so in the morning, he goes out and says to the people of Jezreel, look, I'm the one who killed Joram, and so you don't have to feel bad about that, but who killed these? In other words, I didn't kill these young boys. What does that tell you? It tells you that I have the people's support. Even Samaria is behind me. This isn't just me wanting to be king. Even the people in charge of Ahab's sons want me to be king. From here, Jehu wants to make a point about God. He says in chapter 10, verse 10, know then that there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he said by his servant. And obviously, this is a brutal story. It's a brutal story. And yet it teaches us a pretty important lesson, and that is God keeps every single promise he's ever made about showing mercy to those who trust in him, and yet he also keeps every single promise he ever made about executing his judgment on those who don't. It's obviously a lot of vengeance, and Jehu's not done yet. He sets out to go to Samaria when on the way he meets with the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Neither group seems to recognize one another, but once Jehu discovers who they are, he has his army take them alive and then slaughter them at the pit of Beth Eked. We're not told this is something that God wanted him to do. This seems to be Jehu's thing. Perhaps he was worried how they'd react once they found out what he had done to Ahaziah. I don't know. What I do know, however, is that God saw this and he wasn't happy with it. because we read in Hosea 1:4 that he told Hosea to name one of his sons Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And of course, one reason God's not happy with this and is upset about this is because really when Jehu attacks the descendants of Ahaziah, who's he attacking? He's attacking the seed. Because this is where the Messiah is going to come from. So this is Jehu definitely overstepping his bounds. And really, as we read all this, it just seems like Israel's such a big mess and everyone is so ungodly. And you wonder, what could God be doing in this? And is there anyone who loves God anymore? And there were still, even in the middle of all this mess, there were men who loved God. And one of those men was someone named Jehonadab, the son of Rechab. And we learn a little bit more about this man in Jeremiah 35, which uses an alternative spelling of his name. And there we see that he seemed to have been someone who was rejecting all the bad things in Canaanite culture and seeking to remain true to Yahweh. Jehu recognizes this even because once he's assured that Jehonadab is on his side, he takes him up and says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." Not only is Jehu going to judge Ahab's descendants, he's also committed to judging anyone who served Baal. But we see in verses 18 through 27 of chapter 10, he does this in a very tricky way. He tells the people, if Ahab served Baal a little, he's going to serve him much. And he commands them to gather all the priests of Baal together, saying that if any of them for some reason doesn't show up, they're going to die. When the reality was, if they did show up, they were going to die. The writer tells us this ahead of time. He slips in the comment. He says, "But Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshipers of Baal." That's in verse 19. He orders a special assembly, supposedly for the worship of Baal. And he gathers all the worshipers of Baal together. And by all, we mean all. There was not a man left who did not come. They then entered the house of Baal, and this was a huge crowd. The house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. He tells the person in charge of the clothes to dress them all in special outfits. He goes into the house of Baal with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and he tells them he wants to make sure there isn't one single worshiper of Yahweh who was in the temple for some reason that day. After making sure they were all idolaters, he stations 80 men outside the house of Baal, and he tells them that if they let anyone out, they'll die. That's some security job, isn't it? If you fail, you die. Once inside, he orders his soldiers to kill every one of them, and they did. After which they brought out a certain pillar that must have had some special significance in terms of Baal worship, and they burn it. Verse 27 and 28 shows just how much God ended up humiliating Baal. We read, "And they demolished the pillar of Baal, and they demolished the house of Baal, and they," listen to it, "they made it a latrine to this day. Thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel." God hates idolatry. Now, obviously Jehu is a pretty complex figure, and a lot of these men are. Is he good? Is he bad? God can use complex, confusing figures. Even here, we don't know for sure that he's actually being zealous for God. This could be political. He might have just been zealous for Jehu, honestly, because where would you have found the most supporters of Ahaziah? Or most supporters of Ahab, Or where would you have found the most Jezebel supporters? I'm sure you would have found them among the worshipers of Baal. So this could be a political move. And we definitely see that not everything's right with Jehu in the next verse, because the writer tells us Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the sons of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, that is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. God does commend Jehu partially for the way in which he executed justice on the house of Ahab. He says that he will have descendants who sit on the throne, but because he was not careful to walk in the way of the Lord, he doesn't bless him absolutely. Instead, God begins the process of judging Israel even in his lifetime. Listen to what chapter 10, verse 32 says God began to do. "In those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel." And so if you imagine Israel like a beautiful blanket, it's like God is slowly cutting it off piece by piece, and he uses Hazael to do it. Ironically, he uses one man who was an instrument of his judgment to judge another man who was an instrument of his judgment. One scholar writes, Jehu's story testifies that one can be used by God and judged by God. We need go no farther than Matthew 7 to find the Jehu paradigm in the New Testament. You can be both used by God and judged by God. Just because you have at some time in some way been the Lord's servant does not mean that you are viewed with the Lord's pleasure. Well, Kings, we're taking our time in this book, and I think it's worth it, because as we take our time in this book, even though there's a lot of things we don't understand and it's difficult at points, it still is so relevant, isn't it? Still is so relevant. But we'll come back and we'll begin the process of finishing this book up in the videos that follow.